Hello, GRCSU, and welcome to another episode of Coffee with Coaches. And we have two very special guests back with us again. We just can't say no. We love them so much. Kathy and Lindsay, who are coaches at Proctor Elementary School. And Kathy is a math coach, and Lindsay's a literacy coach. And they are here today to talk to us about sorting student work. Do you guys want to tell us a little bit more about what they're going to hear about today?
Sure. So we're going to be talking about why we sort student work and how we might go about doing that, and why it might be useful to us.
Awesome. I, for one, am very excited because I absolutely love data and I love looking at student work to see what kind of paths we can go down and things that we can learn. So what do you guys have for us today?
Well, we'll get started. We have some slides to share, and I presume that these will be shared on your website so people will have access to them in the future. Great.
Yes,
thank you.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
All right, so sorting student work to inform instruction. We're going to start talking about why do we sort student work? So there are many reasons we might sort student work. Some of them are listed here. So one of the reasons would be to promote student-focused teaching. So we're teaching based on what our students know and need. We can identify evidence of their understanding of the work that we're teaching them. We can collect baseline data before instruction to determine what it is we need to actually teach them or what they might already know. To determine the needs and plan for small groups, so responsive instruction there. Identify any misconceptions they may have, analyze errors, look for trends, and confirm whether or not the class is ready to move on to the next step. So there are so many reasons why we might sort student work. And we have to think about it as a shift from teaching to assess to teach. Also, looking at student work is something that we need to be doing on a daily basis so that we use what we know from our students today for what we do tomorrow. And it can help us to identify if all of our students missed a concept, what we can reflect as teachers, why might they have missed it, what was a misconception in my teaching, and what can I do about it. So lots of reasons to sort student work.
So what kind of student work should we be looking at when we want to do a sort? I think that one point we really want to make is that this is not something necessarily that will be an add-on to what you're already doing. We certainly, all of us don't need more things to do. So the one way to look at it is to look at authentic work your kids are already doing for you. Collect that and perhaps just use it in a different way than you have in the past. As a small add-on or change in your instruction, you might also develop some formative assessments that are very small, easy to create, easy for students to complete, that you might look at as your evidence of learning. For example, an exit ticket, which I think most people are familiar with. So we want student work or evidence that can be analyzed and sorted in a short amount of time. Not something that you're going to wait for having, a half a day of in-service time to look at with colleagues. What we're talking about here is evidence that you collect today, perhaps look at during your planning time, and make adjustments to tomorrow's instruction based on that evidence. It should be work that's aligned to standards and learning targets that you're working on, and evidence that makes your student thinking visible. So not tasks where students could guess for example, yes, no questions, true, false questions, even multiple choice questions. There's a place for those, and we might get into that a little bit, how you might use those in work sort for specific reasons. But typically the best thing to look at would be evidence that makes student thinking visible. So for example, I'll give you some examples in math, and Lindsay will jump in with some examples in literacy. Looking at tasks from the PNOA. So if you're already doing the PNOA, you might look more closely at it. And instead of looking at the scores or the achievement levels, you might look at specific tasks and what students are actually doing. So for example, I'll use this example later perhaps as well, but if you're looking at operations and the scoring involves automaticity and accuracy, but you might sort it in terms of the strategies that students are using rather than whether it was right or wrong. You could also look at quizzes from programs you're using, for example, Bridges checkpoints, or even unit tests, and look at tasks where students have to do some kind of performance rather than just write an answer. So again, wanting to get at the student thinking, at perhaps the models that they're using to show their thinking, the strategies that they're using, and how they communicate those. So those are the kinds of things that we ideally want to look at when we're sorting student work.
In the area of literacy, there's so many things that we're already doing in the classroom that we can use to sort. Things like stacking dots, you can sort based on the learning target from that day. You could sort based on their extended responses on a weekly basis, their writing samples. You could sort word work dictations, whether that's Orton-Gillingham dictations or foundations, anything like that. And you could do sorts with FMPs, both with accuracy and decoding, as well as comprehension strategies. So lots of different things that we're already doing that we can use.
Lisa mentions that one of her former teaching partners used to collect one-question quizzes and use them in this same way to plan reteaching groups. Great idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so we now have the work that we're going to sort. So how do we go about doing that? So the first thing that you want to do is identify the learning target. Make sure it's really clear what it is you're sorting for. Identify the success criteria for each level of proficiency. So what will it look like if a student has met the expectation, they're approaching, they're exceeding, or they're not there yet? Then after you've done that, you do your initial sort into those 4 piles and examine each set of work more closely to determine your next steps and groupings. And once you've gotten sorted into those 4 groups, you may do another sort within those groups to really dig down into what do my students really know and what do I need to teach them in order to take them to the next step. So as an example, in literacy, we happen to be working in nonfiction units, so that's kind of at the top of my mind right now. So if a learning target were to be students will be able to identify the main idea, supporting details, and to summarize the text, I may then say that if the student is meeting it, that is exactly what they're doing. If they're not yet there, they may just be able to identify the main topic. If they're approaching, maybe they can identify the main idea and key details, but they don't have the summary. And then take it a step farther with exceeding, maybe they can identify multiple main ideas, supporting details, and summarize the text. So I would sort the student work into those 4 areas and then dig down deeper into what they're able to do in each of those areas. And Kathy will share an example in math.
Sure. My example is a little bit different, not necessarily referring specifically to the proficiency levels, but just another way of looking at the work. So the initial sort, for example, with the PNOA example that I mentioned previously, if the standard or the target is to fluently add or subtract within a certain number range, for example, within 10 for first grade or within 20 for second grade, using mental strategies, that's a big concept, a big skill for first and second graders. So I might initially, using that PNOA information, use my score, use my accuracy score to sort them. But then within each pile for that next sort, I would be looking at strategies used perhaps. So for example, did they use their fingers? Were they counting all from starting at 1? Were they counting on starting with one of the add-ins for subtractions? Were they counting up or counting back? So I could look more closely at the strategies used in order to determine what students need next in order to move them forward. For a higher grade level, for example, 4th grade, a standard I might be looking at might be apply and extend previous understandings of multiplication to multiply a fraction and a whole number. And so thinking about where a student might be with multiplication with whole numbers might be at a much more sophisticated, efficient level, like using understanding rules and properties and having an algorithm perhaps. But then when we introduce the idea of a fraction being multiplied by a whole number, they might go back to a more visual or concrete level of work. So they might be using repeated addition initially. So having an understanding of how kids work in that or how they progress in that developmental level with a skill is really helpful and necessary in order to maximize the benefit of doing these sorts. So I can look at where a student is in their development, the models and strategies they're using, and kind of group kids strategically to work on moving forward. Strategically might be putting kids who are using like strategies or models together to talk about it. It might be mixing them up so that they get exposure to other ways of doing things from their peers. So there's, I think what it comes down to is being intentional in your sorts and in your planning. What is it that I really want to do with this information? So next we want to talk about what are we going to do with the sorted work. So we have our piles. We have decided how to sort them. So we have a better understanding of what students are able to do. And I want to emphasize that, looking at it from an asset point of view, not a deficit point of view. So looking at student work with the eyes of what do I see here that's great? What can we celebrate? What are they able to do? What have they shown in their work that they're feeling confident with? And then again, what's the next step for them? Rather than sorting it by what are they struggling with or what can they not do? We only have that one piece of evidence to look at, and we don't really know what they don't know or what they can't do from that piece of evidence. What it shows us is what they can do or what they do understand in that moment in time. So using that. So in our second sort, we might be looking for those misconceptions or errors. So that seems like a deficit, but it's really just in determining how to move them forward. So when we have the sorted work, then we can make decisions about what students need next. We can think about it in terms of what does the whole class need? What do small groups need? What do individual students need? So we might be planning our whole class mini lessons from this sort, keeping in mind that that would be whole class, and we have to think about making sure that those lessons allow access for all students. So thinking about having a low floor, high ceiling, sometimes we refer to it as, so a place where every student has a place to enter the work and participate. Perhaps some of the work of the lesson might be a little difficult for some kids, so we consider it exposure to grade level content at that time, and then making sure that we're thinking about those kids who have perhaps achieved some of the goals of the grade level, and we really need to have an opportunity for them to go forward as well. So when we think about whole class instruction, we make sure that we are including everyone. But then with our sort, we can also look at those small groups that we've formed, and we realize that currently with COVID restrictions, a lot of us are not pulling small groups together, but I think it's still reasonable to plan for small groups. And then you just have to think about, how do I get this instruction out to my students? So it might be through videos that you share with certain students, not all of your students. It might just be in the work that you choose for them to do and share back to you. So you're planning for small groups, even though you might not physically be pulling small groups together in your classroom. And then there's also a place for one-on-one conferencing, using the information that you gain from your work sort. And an opportunity to plan individualized or differentiated work for perhaps menu time or small group individual independent work time for students. In trying to determine what students need next, you might look at learning progressions, you might look at the standards, trying to gain an understanding, and sometimes beyond your grade level content or standards on knowing where students are from the work sort and then determining what would be next. So understanding that learning progression, and at the end of our slides here, we have some links to some places that you might look where you can get that information. And then thinking about questions for students. How do I dig a little deeper with a student to understand what they know and what's getting in the way for them, perhaps something they're confused about, something that's not clear, misconceptions perhaps that they have. So thinking about those questions, and I like to sit down with a student and kind of leave it open, like, let's just look at your work, tell me about it. Some kids respond to that well and some don't. So sometimes you have to be more specific. In math, I like to think of it as somewhat of a recipe or a step-by-step process. So I might ask them, what did you do first? And that might help them to start talking about the work that's in front of them. Or I might even need to be more specific, like point out an equation and say, where did the number 9 come from in this equation? And they might have to go back in their work then and start talking about it. So it really varies by student, how easy that conversation is and the types of questions that you'll want to ask. So you really need to know your math and you really need to know your students. And then the last thing for things to do with the sorted work would be to use it to give feedback to students. And this is really important that they're part of this process. So they have an understanding through the sort. As teachers, we're trying to gain an understanding of where kids are in their learning, but students need to have that information as well. They need to know where they're headed. They need to know where they are at this point in time. So start, making sure that we give positive feedback. So for example, in math, for a student who's working on certain operations or facts, I might give feedback about how great their accuracy is. But then their goal might be to start using more efficient strategies. So being really clear and specific with kids and giving them feedback that will help them to move forward so that they know what they're working on. Lindsay, did you want to add anything to this?
No, I think you covered it well. Thank you.
Okay.
So I have a quick question about that.
Sure.
I can see how all of this would work within my classroom, and I'm thinking how I could use this sorted work outside of the classroom too. Do you guys ever use it in like cross-grade work, or do you use it in PLCs? Do you use it in any other way outside of the individualized classroom?
We have sorted work in our math PLCs with the consultant who we're currently working with. And I do think there is great value in doing this with a colleague. So what we've been talking about today is doing these rather quick sorts, perhaps during your planning time. So you're most likely doing it on your own. But so it's really to drive day-to-day planning, but certainly there's great value in doing it with colleagues and doing more long-term planning, or just for our own professional learning to just understand the math better, understand how we interact with student work and benefit from that information that we get from it. I think they're both extremely valuable and somewhat for different purposes. But definitely, as anytime you can look at student work with a colleague is something I would jump on the opportunity for. One thing that I would add to that, though, is I would really recommend, if you're going to do that, that you look at a whole class's work or a large group of work. I think there's always a risk in asking teachers to bring 1 or 2 pieces, because they will, it would just depend on the 2 students that they choose. What kind of picture of the student learning you get, I think there's great value in looking at the whole class. Even if you and I were to get together and we would just look at my class's work one day, perhaps, and another time look at another class's work. But I think to isolate certain pieces from a class, unless there's a specific reason to do that, for example, trying to work with a colleague to figure out why this student seems to be stuck and not going anywhere. So getting some feedback from a colleague on that would be great, looking at one student's work. But I think when you're looking big picture at our practice and student learning, that it's best to look at a large sampling or a whole class sampling.
We've used a version of this. We have a couple teachers who are teaching the same grade level this year. And as we are building our new units of study, when we finished our character unit, those 3 teachers were able to sit down and talk about the performance tasks that they gave their students and what went well and what didn't go as well in each class. And they were able to have great discussions about, oh, it went well in your class. What did you do differently than what I did? So I think there's a way to use this work with colleagues in a slightly different way than these quick sorts. So these are just a list of questions from Research for Better Teaching, things to consider as you're sorting work. And again, we would emphasize that asset focused versus deficit focused in these questions. These will be available. I think they mentioned the coaches that they will share this PowerPoint, so you'll have access to these questions at that point.
And then we came up with some frequently asked questions. The big one being, what if the student work really doesn't show the student thinking? So you collect, perhaps for a math example, you give a math problem and the directions say to solve, show your thinking, and you get back work that just has an answer on it. So it's really not a big help in understanding the student's level of their math understanding. So I think it goes back to what all of our work as educators goes back to, is those expectations up front. So when you start working with your students in the beginning of the year, you teach expectations for how perhaps the math workshop block will go, just about everything in your classroom. So students producing work for you needs to be taught as well. There's an expectation. One way to do that is to model it. So the best place that I see in the math workshop model that we use in Proctor is we start each lesson with a launch or a number talk. And so in that number talk, students are doing mental math and communicating it, and the teacher is recording their thinking. So it's a great place to show lots of different ways that my thinking can be put down on paper for other people to see. So I think having those models for kids is huge. You could also develop a chart with your class on what those expectations are so that they can refer to it. What does showing my thinking on paper, what does that mean? What can that look like? Have some examples perhaps as part of the chart. And what does my answer need to look like? Often teachers really emphasize that because the last number you write on the page is not necessarily your answer. Some kids think that where their answer is in their work is going to be evident, and it isn't always. So making sure that students understand how to make that clear. But I think the big piece of it is how to get my thinking down on paper. And for kids who are resistant to write or take risks, that can be difficult. So teaching them different models in math, how to structure a sequence of equations so that it makes sense. Just the organization on paper is a huge thing for kids. So there's a lot of upfront teaching with that. And some kids grab onto it really quickly, and others it's more of a struggle. And so that could even be a sort in your work, that you're sorting student work by how well they're able to communicate their thinking, and you can work on that in small groups or individually as well if necessary. One of your piles in your sort might be that unknown pile. I'm not sure where to put this because I really am not clear from what I'm looking at what the student knows or is able to do, and that's simply the need to go back and have a conversation with that student. That conversation is going to give you the insight into their thinking, hopefully, and help you to then decide where they belong in your sort. But you might have a question mark pile initially that you have to get more information on. And so on this page, we have some protocols that people are welcome to explore. And so there's links here that will be shared with this slide presentation, as well as some other resources that might be helpful if you're jumping into this work. And then Lindsay and I are always, of course, available through email if people want to contact us individually with questions or wanting more information. And I think that is it for our presentation. Any other questions?
Lisa had a comment, I think, going back to the idea of using the student work with rather other teachers or other groups. She said, great activity idea to share this kind of data in PLC type groups. Agreed. Corey or Al, do you have any questions?
I think everything was covered really well. They went right through from start to beginning, gave some great examples. Expertly done. Thank you.
You're welcome. Happy to do it.
Corey, were you saying something? I think you were talking, but you were muted. You're good. Nope, your sound's just not working. Corey always has wonderful and wise things. All right. Well, you guys, this was great. This was so awesome. And as they did mention, we will include the links that they had in the slideshow so that you can access those at any time. And I know they both are willing and able to answer questions or help out. And as are the rest of the three of us, so Corey, Al, and myself, we love doing this sort of thing too. So reach out to us and we can help in any way. So thank you for joining us early today, and we will see you next Wednesday.